Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear brethren in Christ, the fact that my paper has been assigned an honor accompanied by, of course, responsibility to open the first working session, I guess has more to do with its chronological sequence, that it should cover stuff before the schism and not perhaps its relevance. And both the issue of responsibility and relevance requires perhaps kind of clarification on my side. While personally being very much enthusiastic about this conference for, so to say, spiritual and personal reasons, and thus very grateful to organizers for inviting me to speak here today, at the same time I feel a little bit undeserving in a sense that it seems that the majority of papers will be in, so to say, more narrow ecclesiastical matters, that is theology, liturgy, or whatever. And my background in history and anthropology makes me somewhat of a secularist, in a sense, from outside a very, very narrow ecclesiastical dimension. Still, perhaps this disadvantage might turn out to be also some kind of advantage as a view from outside the focus. For this, I would start with an observation by Edward Gibbon in his Decline and the Fall of Roman Empire, quoting his otherwise probably sarcastic words, but I find them inspiring. The theologian may indulge the pleasing task of describing religion as she descended from heaven, arrayed in her native purity. A more melancholy duty is imposed on the historian. He must discover the inevitable mixture of error and corruption which she contradicted in a long residence upon earth, among a weak and degenerate race of human beings. Now, this distinction between history and theology might be superficial, although I don't think it is. Yet appreciating Gibbon's observations, putting aside his irony, mutatis mutandis, we perhaps might make some use of this observation. So what I want to say is that never denying the central importance of ecclesiastical dimension of the schism and its consequences, be it ecclesiological, theological, liturgical, spiritual, just name them, my deep impression from studying history from outside, as I said, is that what we got to use to call great schism in the long run did divide the church, but actually had much to do with the non-theological, non-ecclesiastical reasons. Of course, it's no novelty that factors lying outside the ecclesiastical realm, narrowly understood, played not a small role in the coming and deepening of the schism. So political dimension, I guess, is the first among those that come to our mind. After all, the emperors, courtiers, and all sorts of likes were closely engaged on both sides of this rift, sometimes helping, sometimes not. So we shall hear more about important persons and events in the following papers, I guess. And so I'll not be talking about events or persons. What I propose to examine here is to briefly consider the time allowed in a form of sketch, rather kind of cultural tapestry, consisting of linguistic, ethnic, and cultural differences that, in my view, played not a small role in the coming and deepening of the schism. In other words, my task is thus rather narrow, to remind us on the development of prejudices between the Western and Eastern Christians in the period preceding the schism. So about the chronology. The 12th century is a period commonly considered by historians as crucial for deterioration of relations between the Latin West and the Greek East. This notion fits well with interpretation that the schism of 1054 was no big deal for the contemporaries. And then in this interpretation, the real nasty things happened after the schism. Such a view is not lacking among historians. Among famous Byzantinists, Anthony Kaldelis comes to my mind, and you will probably know many more theologians who would hold a similar view. This might be true, and there is ample evidence on both sides of spectrum to affirm it. Now, the point of departure of this paper is somewhat different. It's by tracking the long history of prejudices that I feel can help us to assess more successfully not only the event of the schism, but also its disastrous outcomes in the long run. So, again, what do I mean by that? As I stated in the abstract, the existence of prejudice is based on the difference between whether real or perceived between Latins and the Greeks was among the oldest and most poisonous non-theological factors that played a role in causing and deepening of the schism. The division Latin versus Greek is of course older than Christianity in itself, and as such it was inherited in certain measure by both sides. And that seems to be rather simple. Latins thought the Greeks were cunning, tricky, effeminate, cowardly folks, while the Greeks considered Latins greedy and thuggish barbarians. Well, of course, scholarship, particularly history, is here to prove that it's much more complex than that. And it's by exploring the deep roots, centuries-long survival, and finally restoration of these prejudices that can help us to glimpse the complexity of the historical circumstances surrounding the schism and its outcomes. So, taking into consideration the most recent developments in imagology discipline, the historiography of identity and identity formation in both East and West, I would like to explore some cases or exempla of how actually this mutual prejudices functioned on the level of text and understanding. Okay, as already noted, this thing, the schism, the trouble was long in making. Moreover, longer than Christianity, as what we would call nowadays cultural diversity would in the long run turn into devil's playground, considering this division. This is, of course, not an occasion to lecture in history, but I would like to provide just a few slides as a reminder of the usage of the terms that I would be using here. Of course, we know that the term Greek for a long time being was used almost as synonymous or alternative to the Hellen or different types of Greekness from the classical authors. But what is important here that this term Greek started to be used by Latin authors only in the early Middle Ages, basically. And I think it's very important to go back to the historical situation in which we can actually decide what were these contact zones, what was these areas in which the schism, how to say, is going to take place. Now, the problem is with, in my view as a historian and so to say cultural anthropologist, that very often the debates on such a thing as schism focus on theological, liturgical or other kind of matters as they happen in some sort of vacuum. So I hope that reminding us on what it meant to be Greek or Latin in early Middle Ages for a few centuries might have, and what kind of role it might have played in this division. Okay, as a result of this, then we can actually trace the areas which were under the control or rule of the early Byzantine Empire that were not Greek in ethnical or linguistic sense. And in these terms, it is of course very important to put in context the administrative organization, the ecclesiastical organization, on which I will not dwell in details, but rather just to remind us on the development of the, so to say, shape and the borders of the Byzantine Empire at the beginning of this period. According to my opinion, this is one of the most important developments that should be taken into consideration. Byzantine or late Roman Empire at the beginning of the 7th century, as you see in these statistics, considered of perhaps 30% of Greek-speaking populations. Perhaps 65% could be considered Orthodox in late antique or early Christian categories, and 25% were under the jurisdiction of Constantinopolitan Patriarchate. 200 years later, it was almost like more than 90% Greek, Orthodox, and under the control or jurisdiction of Constantinopolitan Patriarchate. So, to quote the words of famous Byzantinist Warren Treadgold, the smaller Byzantine Empire of the 9th century was much better defined. It was not only overwhelmingly Orthodox, but also Greek and whatever. And it says that it actually fitted to description of the Greek Empire much more than the late Roman or early Byzantine Empire some centuries before. Okay, so this is the starting point. Now, when this, so to say, Latin notion of the Greeks, which will take on negative connotations, originates. Actually, it's interesting that the word Greek in Latin text and author is very rarely used before the second half of the 8th century. And this is this very specific context when it started to be used. As you see on this slide, actually, it was a strategy of Latin authors to neglect the Roman universal jurisdiction of the emperor residing in Constantinople. And it's, I think, very important to understand the language used by the Latin authors who started to use this word Greek in order to say, no, this guy's Constantinople is not the universal Roman Empire. And it went along with a process in which actually the popes in Rome took side with the Franks. That means that basically Germanic or Frankish Carolingian rulers started to consider themselves proper emperors, and as the result, the strategy of the writers was somehow to neglect legitimacy of the Greek ruler. Because if you say Roman Empire, it sounds quite different than if you just say the Greek one. Along with this usage of the Greeks in Latin texts, it also actually revived old Roman pre-Christian prejudices or negative stereotypes about the Greeks. Now, all this as a result had, in a way, a creation of something that was called Byzantinism, or negative image of Byzantium, which is in modern terms sometimes compared to Orientalism or Balkanism or something that is creating an image of the other which has all these negative features, whatever. So to quote Dmitry Angelov, one of the authors who wrote extensively on this, the denunciation of Byzantium as civilization and a historical legacy is a discourse and a mental construct with a very long history and is defined as essentialist and negative understanding of medieval civilization that places it into rigorous analytical categories from a Western and modern viewpoint. Okay, what is important to stress here that some usually progressive in ideological terms thinkers, consider that the problem started with 19th century nationalism, whatever. The opinion of the medievalists, of course, dealing with early medieval period, shows that actually already in early medieval period there was much of, so to say, hatred, irritation, antipathy, whatever. So where can we detect these things? As I mentioned, showing this map, it's particularly in the contact zones when the Greeks and Latins had opportunity to know each other. And as I said, 12th century is usually considered to be the time when all went wrong, but actually if we very cautiously go for case studies of Lombard or Norman chronicles in southern Italy, which is one of these contact zones, it's very clear, just to make it very short, that the Latin authors had very, very, very bad opinion about the Byzantines or the Greeks. Moreover, to quote Erempert, one of the monks of Monte Cassino, he considered the Byzantines were actually Christians only in theory, but in practice they were worse than Muslims. And then we can just trace the chronicle after chronicle, naming and reminding us of how Greeks are deceitous and whatever, just listing lists and lists of Greek crimes. Very similar to these are the Norman chroniclers from the 11th century. But just to sum it up, what comes out of this is the fact that these authors, whether they were using some sort of ideological constructs in order to present the Greeks that they didn't like for different political reasons, they created a corpus of texts that circulated around Europe. And if one asks a question, what typical Latin in the West could know about the Greeks? Of course, nothing from personal experience. But what was in circulation were texts. And these texts, it's very interesting, from southern Italy, actually very much build on old Roman prejudices against the Greeks. For example, in one of these chronicles, we have an example when the author states, okay, these are the heirs of, I don't know, Hector, Achilles, and all these guys, showing that he knows very well the ancient authors, and saying, look to what they fell in our days. So obviously it's not that we have to wait for the Renaissance to have all these things discovered. In early Middle Ages they were still playing with all these notions. Okay, then again, just to sum it up, these chronicles does not always or do not always show just the hatred, antipathy, whatever, these kind of things. There are some examples, but prevailingly the image of the Greeks became very negative from the 9th through 10th to 11th century, and this all precedes the schism. So my logical conclusion would be that considering the schism in the context of general antipathy and prejudice, whatever, didn't need really theological reasons to explode. They were actually in making, in sense of this imagology, how people perceived each other. This is also very important for the topic that I cannot, of course, delve in details, and this is formation making, so to say, how the identity of the Latins and the Greeks both was, so to say, constructed during the centuries. As the theory of identity nowadays confirms, identity always needs alterity. And this alterization, the creation of the other, is a very important element of showing what we are not. Normans considered themselves to be very brave, and the Byzantines were, of course, cowards. This is just like how it functions, but it can be traced on many different levels. Okay, just very briefly, what I would move towards my conclusions. What I would say here that while prejudices we have detected have been part of the image of the Byzantines, might not have been shared by everyone, they certainly formed what may be described as the prevailing rational discourse, or to use Michel Foucault's term, episteme of the Western intellectuals. Be these events and situations true or not, I will not discuss it here, but they actually really made a deep imprint in the opinion and ideas of the Westerners. With accepting this came the most disastrous effect, and this is the loss of trust. As the process of identification in the early modern analogy, that of confessionalization, I think that's very well explored in 16th and 17th century, developed, these two communities started to, so to say, exclude each other in terms of identity, belonging, connections, and whatever. So one of these, some of the outcomes that I would like to stress here is the following. Mutual distrust was not caused by the schism, nor the theological reason that lay behind it or caused it. It's rather the opposite. I think it is in the long term that theological, more broadly speaking, ecclesiastical differences intervened with, let's call them, cultural ones. Secondly, mutual distrust was older than theological disputes and ecclesiastical divisions, and it was deep and bitter already by the 11th century. So we shouldn't just put our pink glasses and say everything was fine before the Crusades or the thing. It all had long-term consequences for the formation of identity and all the way until today. The strength of these explains, at least in certain measure, why no amount of goodwill, scholarly clarity, and personal sanctity of the participant in attempts at restoring unity between 11th and 15th century were, I'm somewhat hesitant to say it, doomed to fail. As for today, I think it's the task of historians to explore the past without trying to neglect the problems, social scientists to measure the influence and the strength of the historical traditions and heritage, and finally the pastoral workers to cope with it. But if we want to face reality as it is without demonizing it or at the same time putting like pink lenses, I believe we are to include all these dimensions. So in my view, some kind of conclusion would be that what is important for us here is seeking truth, negotiating common ground where it's possible, and perhaps before anything, regaining trust. I think as Christians we are at least should be well equipped for all the three. Now, if time permits or not, just a few more minutes, I see and also some problems, hindrances towards these goals. First, I think that this, what I would call narrowly theological view on the schism, is that sometimes it's viewed as it happened in vacuum and some kind of pure ideas. In pure world of ideas, and it's equally, I think, bad as very materialistic approach which says it's only economy or whatever. So I think this is one of the temptations. Second one is the mentality, sectarian mentality, often a subgroup of theological view, of course, that perhaps the simplest and often fueled by certain self-righteousness is to say, okay, we are right and you are wrong, God is on our side. Well, God bless you with this position, now you know the truth, and then there is not much to talk. Opposite to these are certain modern or postmodern approaches which somehow move into the direction of politically correct vision of history, trying to say everything was fine, everything was just fine, there were no problems before the nations or whatever. Another modern problem deriving from this approach is deep relativism that tends to express itself in impenetrable jargon of scholarly debate that you don't know what they are talking about anymore. So altogether in this, my concluding remarks will be the following. It turns out thus that certain part of the whole trouble has an obvious face, even very human, to borrow Nietzsche's word, all too human. By stating this, I don't want to downscale the schism to the human size only, God forbids, yet, from what I can see, the greatest thinkers, the holiest churchmen of the age, were and still are children of their own age, of course. The testimony of a great man, both of West and East, who were able to rightfully, without prejudice, judge, of course, abounds. Yet it was often more in the streets of Constantinople or military camps of the Crusaders that the future and the destiny of the Church was given direction. And there is seemingly no haste of thought and spirit that are untouched by the burden of the flesh, by the turbulence of our own days. It is thus perhaps not entirely inappropriate that we are reminded, before we plunge into the depths of theological speculation, or rise to appreciation of the delights of divine liturgy, that we are all fragile, miserable creatures, often unable to recognize good from evil. As Christians, of course, we know that this realization is not the end, but the beginning of salvation. So, aware of our miserable state, I would end up with the old invocation to most glorious, ever Virgin Mary, Mother of Christ our God, to accept our prayers and present them to thy Son, our God, that we may proceed in this direction to salvation of our souls and our churches. So, thank you very much.